Everything at Golden Crest, a prestigious restaurant known for serving the city's elite, seemed perfect, until a single moment shattered the illusion. A young waitress, dismissing a quiet man at the back, assumed he wasn't worthy of the restaurant's high standards. Her voice, dripping with condescension, cut through the air, catching the attention of nearby patrons. What she didn't know. This moment would define her future. Before we dive into today's story, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. And if you enjoy stories that challenge perspectives, be sure to hit subscribe for more compelling twists from Plot Twist Story.
Plot Twist Story.
Golden Crest Restaurant was a sanctuary of luxury, its lavish chandeliers casting a soft golden hue across polished wooden floors. Fine china, crystal glasses, and velvet-upholstered chairs reflected exclusivity, where only the most affluent guests dined in peace. Waiters moved with precision, serving dishes with an air of perfection. But beneath the gleaming surface, not all guests received equal treatment. Ashley Monroe, a stunning blonde waitress in her late 20s, was one of the restaurant's most sought-after servers. Known for her ability to charm wealthy patrons, she held herself with an air of superiority, carefully curating her interactions based on a guest's appearance. To her, the rich deserved exquisite service, while those who didn't fit in were nothing but inconveniences. One evening, as the restaurant hummed with quiet sophistication, the door swung open and David Evans entered. He was in his early 30s, neatly dressed in a well-fitted sweater and slacks, yet what caught everyone's attention was his wheelchair. The polished chrome frame of his chair reflected the golden light, making it impossible to ignore. David maneuvered toward the hostess stand, his movements effortless yet controlled. His face was composed, carrying an aura of quiet confidence. However, Ashley saw something else, a burden. She sighed, stepping forward with an exaggerated smile that barely masked her irritation. "Can I help you?" Her tone was tight, forced. David nodded, unfazed. "Table for one, please." Ashley hesitated, scanning the crowded restaurant before her eyes landed on a poorly lit corner near the kitchen door. "Right this way," she said curtly, leading him toward the least desirable seat in the house. David glanced around, noticing the countless empty tables with better accessibility. He turned back to Ashley. "Actually, I'd prefer one near the window if possible." Ashley's smile thinned. "Those are reserved for other guests." "Other guests?" David arched a brow. "I wasn't aware seating was assigned based on preference." Ashley exhaled sharply. "It's just policy." The tension in the air was palpable, yet David remained calm. With a small nod, he wheeled himself toward the undesirable corner, choosing to observe rather than escalate. Little did Ashley know, every move she made was being carefully noted. David waited patiently, his presence ignored as Ashley moved gracefully around the restaurant, catering to high-profile guests with charm and attentiveness. She never once glanced in his direction. He watched as wine glasses were refilled before they were even empty, plates arrived promptly, and soft laughter floated through the air. Yet, at his table, nothing. After nearly 30 minutes, David calmly lifted his hand. Ashley approached, visibly irritated. "Yes? I'd like to order now." She tapped her pen against her notepad, making no attempt to hide her impatience. "Fine. What do you want?" David placed his order, and Ashley jotted it down lazily before disappearing without another word. When his food finally arrived, it was cold. David poked at the dish, lifting an eyebrow but saying nothing. Instead, he observed. He watched how Ashley's demeanor changed depending on who she served. To one guest, a businessman dripping in luxury, she leaned in, offering flirtatious smiles and light conversation. To an older woman dining alone, she was polite but distant. To him, she offered nothing but disdain. Then came the final straw. As David reached for his drink, his hand slipped slightly, a common occurrence due to his nerve damage. The glass tipped over, spilling water across the table. Ashley whipped around at the sound, eyes flashing with irritation. Instead of assisting, she grabbed a napkin, rolled it into a ball, and threw it onto David's lap. "Clean it up yourself," she sneered. A stunned silence fell over the nearby tables. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, while others simply looked away, unsure how to react. David's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm, measured. "I see. Is that your usual standard of service?" Ashley scoffed. "For people like you?" "Yes." The weight of Ashley's words still hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the subtle clinking of silverware as a few guests hesitated to continue their meals, their eyes darting between Ashley and David. Some looked away in discomfort, pretending not to have heard. Others, however, stared in quiet shock. David, his hands resting calmly on the arms of his wheelchair, took a measured breath. He had spent years facing discrimination, condescension, and ignorance, but rarely had it been this blatant, this deliberate. The sting of Ashley's words wasn't just in their cruelty, it was in the raw, unfiltered truth of her attitude, the belief that she could say such things without consequence. Just as he opened his mouth to respond, another voice cut through the tension, strong and unwavering. "I hope that's not how Golden Crest treats all its guests." The voice belonged to Richard Lawson, the restaurant's owner, a man in his early 50s with a commanding presence. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of authority that made heads turn the moment he spoke. His entrance was unplanned, but his timing couldn't have been more perfect. Ashley's face went ghostly pale as she turned, realizing who had just spoken. Her confident smirk vanished, replaced by something David recognized instantly: fear. David, meanwhile, looked up and smiled slightly. "Ah, Richard. Good to see you." The casual familiarity in his tone only made Ashley's panic worse. They knew each other. And judging by the way Richard's expression darkened, it was clear that David was no ordinary guest. "David," Richard's voice held an edge of concern as he took in the spilled water, the napkin still lying crumpled on his lap, and the unmistakable humiliation in the air. "I didn't realize you were stopping by tonight." David's lips quirked into a small, almost amused smile. "I like to keep things spontaneous. You know how it is." Richard's gaze shifted sharply to Ashley. "Would you care to explain what just happened?" Ashley swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly as she struggled to formulate a response. The arrogance she had worn so proudly just moments ago had completely disappeared. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "And that's exactly the problem," Richard said coldly. Ashley's breathing quickened as Richard's words settled in. He wasn't just upset, he was furious. Richard's eyes narrowed. David Evans is one of the most respected voices in disability advocacy. He's a Paralympic athlete, a keynote speaker, and a personal friend. And you, he gestured toward Ashley, his voice sharp, treated him like an inconvenience. The whispers among guests grew louder, some now openly murmuring in disbelief. Recognition flashed across a few faces as they connected the name to the well-known figure. Ashley's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a bad moment, this was career-ending. Her knees felt weak as she desperately tried to salvage what little dignity she had left. "Mr. Lawson, I just thought." Richard cut her off, his voice steel. "No, you didn't think. You judged. You made assumptions. And you disrespected someone who deserved the highest level of service and respect." Ashley felt the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. Her mouth went dry. She was trapped. David, who had been watching the exchange silently, finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but carried an unmistakable weight. "Richard, let's not make this about me," he said. "The real issue isn't that I'm well known. It's that if I weren't, this still would have happened." Richard turned to him, his expression softening slightly, but his anger remained. "I know. And that's why this won't go unaddressed." Ashley's heart pounded. "Please," she whispered, finally cracking. I made a mistake." The weight of her own words felt suffocating now. Richard regarded her for a long, hard moment before speaking again. His voice was low but firm. "Go to the back office. Wait there. We'll discuss your employment status shortly." Ashley's breath hitched. The finality in his tone was undeniable. With shaky legs, she turned and walked away, every step feeling heavier than the last. As she disappeared behind the kitchen doors, the tension in the restaurant finally began to lift, but the lesson she had just learned would never be forgotten. Just as the moment stretched into an unbearable silence, a new voice cut through the tension. "I hope that's not how Golden Crest treats all its guests." Ashley's head snapped up, and for the first time that night, fear flickered in her eyes. A tall, distinguished man in his early 50s stepped forward. Richard Lawson, the restaurant's owner. David glanced up at him, offering a small smile. "Ah, Richard. Good to see you." Ashley froze. Richard's face darkened as realization dawned. "David. I didn't realize you were stopping by tonight." "I like to keep things spontaneous," David mused. "You know how it is." Richard turned sharply toward Ashley, his expression icy. "Would you care to explain what just happened?" Ashley's mouth opened and closed, her previous arrogance evaporating. I didn't know who he was," she stammered. "And that's exactly the problem," Richard said, his tone laced with disappointment. The weight of her actions crashed down on Ashley, her face draining of color. Ashley sat in the back office of Golden Crest, her mind racing. The confident, arrogant woman who had once strutted across the dining floor with an air of superiority was now reduced to a trembling mess. She clasped her hands together tightly, trying to steady her breath, but the weight of her actions pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. The whispers of the guests, the sharp reprimand from Richard Lawson, the realization that she had humiliated someone so widely respected, it all played in an endless loop in her mind. For the first time, she felt something foreign creeping into her chest, genuine shame. Outside, the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. Guests who had witnessed the scene were still murmuring amongst themselves. Some were appalled, shaking their heads in disapproval. Others, particularly those who had received Ashley's best service before, looked visibly uncomfortable, as if realizing that the kindness they had received came at the expense of those she had deemed unworthy. David remained composed, but Richard could see the slight tension in his jaw, the controlled breath he took before speaking. "Richard," he said evenly, "I don't believe in canceling people. But I do believe in accountability." Richard nodded, absorbing David's words. He turned to the manager, his voice steady. "Ashley will not return to the dining floor. Effective immediately, she is suspended pending further review. Additionally, all staff will undergo mandatory retraining on hospitality and discrimination policies." The manager, still visibly shaken, nodded hastily. "Of course, Mr. Lawson." Ashley, hearing the verdict from inside the office, let out a small, shaky breath. She had feared immediate termination, but this was almost worse. The humiliation of being publicly removed, the realization that her entire career at Golden Crest was hanging by a thread, it was a different kind of punishment. Richard turned back to David. "Would you like to say something to her before she leaves?" David considered for a moment, then nodded. Richard gestured toward the office door, and after a few seconds, Ashley hesitantly emerged. She avoided eye contact, her posture stiff, no longer the confident woman who had so effortlessly dismissed him earlier. David met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Ashley," he began, his voice calm but firm, "do you understand why we're here right now?" Ashley swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Because I judged you. I treated you differently." "Not just me," David corrected. "You treat people like me, anyone who doesn't fit your idea of worthy, as less than. And that's dangerous." Ashley's eyes flickered with something close to realization. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted, her voice small. David sighed. "That's the problem. You never thought about it at all." A long silence stretched between them before Ashley took a deep breath. I'm sorry." For the first time that night, it sounded sincere. David studied her for a moment before nodding. "I hope you mean that. Because next time, it might not be someone like me sitting at that table. It might be someone who doesn't have a voice. And they deserve better." Ashley's throat tightened, but she nodded. She had no defense left. Just the weight of what she had done, and the realization that she could never undo it. Following the incident, Golden Crest underwent significant changes. Richard, deeply shaken by what had occurred, implemented a strict training program emphasizing dignity, inclusivity, and professionalism. Every employee, waitstaff, managers, even kitchen staff, was required to undergo workshops on unconscious bias and ethical service. Golden Crest also introduced a mystery diner program, where anonymous guests of all backgrounds would report on their treatment to ensure that service was held to an equal standard for everyone. As for Ashley, she was given a choice. She could resign or undergo extensive retraining and start over at the lowest position in the restaurant. To everyone's surprise, she chose the latter. She spent weeks in the kitchen, washing dishes, assisting servers, and observing interactions between staff and guests. For the first time, she saw the restaurant from a different perspective. She watched as her former colleagues treated guests with genuine warmth, regardless of their background, and she felt an ache of regret for the years she had spent believing status defined worth. Slowly, she began to change. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Weeks later, Richard invited David back to the restaurant. This time, he was greeted with the utmost respect, not because of his status, but because the staff had truly learned a lesson. As he and Richard sat near the window, overlooking the city, Richard exhaled deeply. "I can't thank you enough for how you handled this." David shook his head. "It's not about me, Richard. It's about the culture you build here. The next guest who walks through that door, whether they're a CEO or a janitor, should get the same experience." Richard nodded, thoughtful. "And Ashley? Do you think she can change?" David gave a small smile. "That's up to her. But if she does, it won't be because she was punished. It'll be because she chose to grow." Richard sat back, contemplating. "Well, if she's willing to learn, I suppose we can all do the same." David lifted his glass. "To progress." Richard clinked his glass against David's. "To progress." As they drank, the atmosphere in Golden Crest felt different. It was no longer just a restaurant catering to the elite, it was a place that understood that respect should never be reserved for the privileged alone. Ashley Monroe had once seen Golden Crest as her domain, where she dictated who was worthy of good service. But now, she was just another employee, relearning what it meant to truly serve. And in the end, the greatest lesson she learned was that dignity isn't something you give based on status, it's something every human being inherently deserves. Ashley was promptly removed from the dining floor, replaced by a more competent server. Richard publicly apologized to David and assured him that immediate action would be taken. David, ever composed, offered a simple nod. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." Richard nodded solemnly. "It won't. Ashley, now standing to the side, eyes red with humiliation, swallowed thickly. I'm sorry, she murmured. David studied her for a moment before replying, I hope you are. And with that, he turned his chair and left the restaurant, leaving behind a shaken staff, humbled guests, and a powerful lesson that would not be forgotten.